In Western society today, we have clear ideas about how our government is supposed to work, ideas that are echoed in many parts of our society. 4 people start a business or a club, and the first thing they do is appoint themselves president, vice president, secretary, and treasurer. Anthropologists call this institutionalized hierarchical leadership, meaning that whoever occupies an office automatically gains status and power, and that the position the person occupies continues beyond his or her tenure. We know that this kind of structure can be effective and efficient, and that incompetent leaders can do great harm. But in our society, we don't know much about alternatives. There can be good leaders and bad leaders, but what about no leaders? One of the marvelous insights gained from anthropology and from archaeology, which is really the anthropology of the past, is that there are other ways of being and doing. Anthropologist Tom Sheridan tells us that the peasant farmers he worked with in Kukurpe value autonomy over cooperative ventures. They tolerate formal organization as a necessary evil, necessary for organizing things like irrigation or a large festival. But they limit it as much as possible. They don't put a priority on creating structures of institutionalized hierarchical leadership. We can ask if the same applies to Mimbres society during the Classic period, and we do this by evaluating 2 sets of expectations. The first expectation is that there should be evidence of social equality. People should have roughly the same kinds of things and live in the same kinds of houses. The second is that there should be considerable diversity in how people organize their lives, indicating that they felt free to make their own decisions. We'll start out evaluating the first expectation. Archaeologist Patricia Gilman did an analysis of grave goods and burials found in 3 classic Mimbres pueblos, the Matic site, the Nan Ranch ruin, and Glaz ruin, and she looked for evidence of inequality. Gilman analyzed 170 burials. She found that most had between 1 and 4 pottery vessels, and 12% had small amounts of jewelry. For example, these 2 bowls are from burials on the Nan Ranch ruin that each had 1 bowl. No burials stood out as especially elaborate or wealthy. And she concluded, this is a quote, "The lack of identifiable elite insignia in burials yield similar results. There are a few differences, but they're very subtle. So subtle, in fact, that they're difficult to illustrate. For example, at the Nan Ranch ruin, the south room block is built with slightly fancier and more substantial materials than the other room blocks. But, as you can see, the rooms are the same sizes and arranged in the same basic configuration. Having established that there were few material wealth differences among people in Mimbres society, we move on to the issue of autonomy. Do we see a diversity in how people carried out their lives? Were they free to make their own choices? To address this question, we look at household organization. We know that in some areas of the Southwest, household organization was very, very standardized. You saw this in the Mesa Verde region, where people built their households in the same way, what are called unit pueblos, for almost 700 years. We see the same in some suburbs today, what Pete Seeger called little boxes made of ticky-tacky. In Mimbres sites, we can look at household arrangements by studying how walls are joined and looking at doors between rooms. This photo from Flying Fish Village in the eastern Mimbres area shows a cooking hearth in the foreground and then a view through a doorway that connects 2 rooms. We examined household arrangements at many sites, and found they took several forms. In some cases, shown in green here, there was one living room which always had a hearth, connected to one or two smaller storage rooms. In other cases, shown in pink, there were two interconnected living rooms, each with a hearth. The differences may seem subtle, but it actually indicates quite different social arrangements. The occupants of the first kind, which we call the flat, would have shared cooking and living arrangements, while the occupants of the second kind, a duplex, might have cooked and eaten separately. In most sites where we have evidence, such as at Nan Ranch Ruin, we find both kinds of arrangements, side by side. Here's a well-documented example of both kinds of room suites at Avalos Canyon Village in the Eastern Mimbres area. Rooms 20 and 21 on the left are joined by a doorway, but both have cooking hearths, so they constitute a duplex. Immediately adjacent, rooms 22 and 23 constitute a flat. Here's a photo of that room block at Avalos Canyon Village. Finally, here's another way of studying the diversity of household arrangements. As you know, unfortunately, many Mimbres sites have been looted, so we can't find evidence of doorways or of hearth placement. But in many cases, we can at least measure room size, and we can look at the ratio of different categories of rooms. As you see here, the ratios are very different across sites and across the areas. So far, we've concentrated on demonstrating that classic Mimbres society did not have institutionalized hierarchical leadership. But it did have many large, long-lived villages, and at least some small irrigation systems. People must have found some ways to live together, to cooperate, and even to coordinate their labor. Mimbres pottery might have been important in instilling a sense of shared identity, which could contribute to cooperation. We see this in the overall conformity of the designs. Although they depict many different figures, they're organized and laid out in a few standardized ways. These two bowls have birds in the center and the same kind of rim treatment. These three bowls show pairs of figures moving around the circle in rotational symmetry. And these two show intertwined bighorn sheep, also in rotational symmetry. Finally, we also see conformity in how rooms were built, even if they were laid out in various ways. Almost all living rooms have 3 roof support posts and a hearth offset from center. Another way of organizing and coordinating in the absence of institutionalized leadership is with ritual, which is the topic of the next lecture.